Special Education by Anna Nicolai. Students are protected under a variety of laws from discrimination based on race, gender, ability, and national origin. Nevertheless, students of color and students with disabilities continue to be subject to various forms of discrimination, including overrepresentation in special education, underrepresentation in special education, or delays in the identification process. The training items at the end of the presentation is an incomplete and ever-evolving list of action steps that work towards breaking down racist special education practices in schools. But before we get to that, here are the overarching legal protections that cover students with disabilities and students of color in schools. Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which I'm going to refer to as Section 504 for the rest of the presentation, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1963, which I'm going to refer to as Title VI for the rest of the presentation. So after we start with these four, basically comes down to this in practice in schools. So racial discrimination falls under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And under Title VI, the OCR can find that a school engaged in unlawful intentional discrimination, this is called the deferent treatment, if based upon the facts of the specific case that the judge deemed that the Office of Civil Rights has deemed that the school treats any students differently from any student in a similar situation because of that student's race. Second, the disparate impact. This means that a policy may be considered race neutral at the implementation or the practice or the procedure, and it wasn't adopted with the intent of being discriminatory, but nevertheless has ended in discriminating against students on the basis of race. Secondly, the free and appropriate education, or the concept of FAPE, which comes to us from Section 504, which is, as we all know, the bare minimum that students with disabilities receive in schools. So students have a right to FAPE, but it should be important to note that compliance under IDEA or Section 504 does not ensure compliance under Title VI. So you can be meeting one, but not the other. Finally, the Office of Civil Rights reviews district and school data for everything that we're about to talk about: referrals, interventions, evaluations, placements, etc. within the special education realm, and they're in charge of disciplinary action for schools if they break any of the laws above here and the sections within the laws here. All right. Some statistics before we move into the training and about kind of grounding us and why this work is necessary. Part of the one piece of the puzzle is overrepresentation of students of color in special education. Black students overall have higher referrals and are identified for special education at a higher rate. Similarly, boys are 70% more likely to be, not 70% more likely, but make up 70% of the population in special education compared to making up about 50% of the population in schools. Overall, Black and Hispanic students are identified at a higher rate in general, but specifically in the categories of intellectual disabilities and emotional disabilities. Black students are at a higher rate of being identified with a learning disability. And something that really interests me was Black students are underrepresented in special education from grades kindergarten, first, and second. But then by third grade, they jump to being overrepresented in special education, and that continues on through graduation. The other piece of the puzzle is underrepresentation in special education. This shows up in a variety of different ways. This could mean less services with from based off of race with the same disability category. So, say a student has a specific learning disability in the area of reading. A Black student, a Hispanic student, and a white student all would receive different services, and trending where a white student would have the most services going downwards between Hispanic and Black students. White students are actually underrepresented in the category of intellectual disabilities. Overall, Asian students are underrepresented in the entire special education system, and this isn't because they have disabilities at a lower rate than anybody else. It's because of the biases and the racism in our identification processes, including cultural differences and in our testing and our overall general education curriculum, interventions, PBIS supports, and even biases within the teachers themselves that are referring students and not recognizing and checking their biases correctly. Another reason for underrepresentation could be a lack of resources on the part of a parent trying to get their student identified. I already talked a little bit about the bias in testing and identification systems. Testing often perpetuates a white culture in a white system, and it is easier for students who are white to pass and be perceived as higher educated when in fact it's just cultural capital that they have instead. All right, training materials. So based off of all of that, we need to start early. Awareness training, including anti-bias and disability awareness. So recognizing biases within yourself and in the institutions that you are in and surrounded by in order to start to disrupt and to make changes. Secondly, disability awareness. If you don't know what a disability looks like, you're not going to know exactly how to identify it and fulfill your child find requirement. Also, the concept of norm can just, if something is not normal, it is not always a disability. So knowing what is a disability and what is not in regards to normal is very important. General education supports is like the first line of defense when you're actually in schools, making sure you have culturally relevant curriculum and, that allows for students to thrive no matter what their cultural background is, to prevent from possible incorrect identification of disabilities. Furthermore, classroom interventions, making sure they are culturally relevant and the PBIS system isn't just a white system, a white reward system. Similarly, the universal screenings need to be culturally relevant, wise, and when you look at them, you also need to make sure that you aren't using your own biases about the students and making sure your grading is as blind as it can be. Similarly to the universal screenings, the testing and evaluation procedures need to follow these guidelines. Minimal unguided discretion in the referral process, which comes into play with the anti-bias training and the disability awareness training. You must interpret results in an unbiased manner, which I talked about in the universal screenings. Do not delay if disability is suspected, even if a student has special factors. This comes into play mostly with students who are also labeled as EL students. Just like the universal screening procedures, make sure your standardized testing that is used in actual decision making, like the WIAT, that's what's used in my school, is culturally relevant, and evaluate that testing data equally. You don't want to be going out of your way to say, well, this student's Black, so it probably wasn't culturally relevant, so they probably don't have a disability, because that can get you into trouble with the Office of Civil Rights, because you are then treating a student differently based on their race. And finally, wraparound supports are critical in getting students at equal playing field in schools. It all doesn't happen in the classroom. So getting informal supports in place, including after-school programs, tutoring, mentoring, outside organizations, all to help meet those basic needs and care that some people lack, and then that ends up being part of why they're misdiagnosed with a disability. When it's not a disability issue, it's a basic care and need issue. And we often conflate the two and gets us into issues with the Office of Civil Rights. And that is all. Thank you so much for listening.